Everyone. We're joined here tonight with Gary Schoniger. I believe I said it correctly there. And Gary is joining us from South Africa, so it's really early in the morning there. So we thank him for his time.
Happy to be here.
So I'm going to get started by reading a little bit about Gary, and then we'll turn it over to him. So Gary is the author and entrepreneur. Gary Schoniger is an internationally recognized thought leader in the field of entrepreneurial mindset education. His message has influenced a broad audience from academic institutions and economic development organizations to government and nonprofit clients worldwide, including the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute, the Colombian Ministry of Education, the U.S. State Department, and the European Commission. As the founder and CEO of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative, Gary led the development of the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program, which has been recognized by the Kauffman Foundation as redefining entrepreneurship education in classrooms and communities around the world. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Gary, and take it away.
Thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate everyone joining us for this webinar. I'm excited to share with you some of what I've learned about entrepreneurship and kind of this journey that I've been on to try to deconstruct the entrepreneurial mindset in a way that can empower students to learn. So let me figure out how to share my screen with you all, and we will jump right in. All right. Can you all see my screen? Yeah, good. All right, excellent. I'm gonna roll here. I'm gonna try not to shout too much, which I'm very excited about these ideas. I tend to get very animated, but it's 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm in my hotel room in Cape Town, South Africa, so I'm gonna try not to annoy everybody in the next room. So again, thanks for joining me. I'm gonna dive right in to talk about the entrepreneurial mindset and how this connects to 21st century learning. So what I've been trying to figure out for some time is what makes entrepreneurs tick and how this connects to learning and student engagement. So we're a small research and training organization based in Cleveland, Ohio, where the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative, our focus is entrepreneurial mindset education programs. We also do keynotes, workshops, professional development, training, and development programs for individuals, organizations, and academic institutions around the world. That's what we do. That's what I'm here in Cape Town, South Africa here, working with a foundation to localize some of our programs to bring it into the school systems in Africa. I'm also, by the way, advising the Ministry of Education in South Africa. They are under a mandate, interestingly enough, to bring entrepreneurial mindset into the entire K-12 system. So just kind of want to put that out there because the world is waking up to the fact that the world has changed in ways that now require everyone to think like an entrepreneur. And I'm emphasizing this word think because I don't mean, when I say entrepreneurial mindset, I don't mean that everyone should start a business. I mean, everyone's going to need to learn how to think like an entrepreneur, whether they work in an established company, whether they become part of the rapidly growing gig economy, or they start a business. It doesn't matter. Every student is going to need to learn how to think this way in the new world. I think it's easy for folks to also understand that entrepreneurial activity is essential to creating vibrant, equitable, and sustainable communities. We need innovative and entrepreneurial people at all levels of society. No one would dispute that. From an individual perspective, I want to point out that learning how to think like an entrepreneur essentially makes an individual future-proof. And when you think about what entrepreneurs do, they are creative, critical thinkers. They're reliable, they're resourceful, they're resilient. They're able to identify and solve problems in resource-constrained, ambiguous environments when the rules are not clear and when the pathway is not well defined. And what I'm saying here is there's unlimited global demand for people who can think like an entrepreneur. That's essentially, when we think about workforce ready skills, um, those are entrepreneurial skills. That's how we make our students future proof. So, as I alluded to in my previous comment, that the world is waking up to the fact that entrepreneurship needs to become part of our education experience, right? It's undeniable that education plays a major role in shaping entrepreneurial mindsets, and we're seeing big thinkers around the world, sort of waking up to this fact. And I just wanted to put this quote here from the World Economic Forum. In a paper they published, they wrote that it's not enough to add entrepreneurship on the perimeter, that it needs to be at the core of the way education operates. And I think it's a really important statement. So, what they're saying is it's not enough to start an entrepreneur club or a business camp or something like that on the perimeter of education, that we need to infuse it into the core of the way our schools operate, which requires new ways of thinking about teaching and learning. And that's kind of what I want to get into. The challenge that we're facing is that our ability to embrace entrepreneurial mindset is limited by the ways in which we define it, right? And so, the vast majority of people on this planet hear the word entrepreneur and they think, oh, that's Mark Zuckerberg. That's somebody who comes up with a brilliant idea, gets millions of venture capital, and starts a huge company. Sometimes they think, oh, that's somebody who owns a Main Street, like a small business on Main Street. And what we found in our research is that these high growth venture backed entrepreneurs that captivate our imagination and they dominate headlines, they just don't represent the mindset and the methods of the typical entrepreneur. In 2007, I was hired by the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in San Jose to sort of do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education ecosystem. And what we found is that the way entrepreneurship is typically characterized in a classroom is largely divorced from the reality, from the mindset and the methods of a typical entrepreneur. And so we set out to do research on what I would call the everyday unlikely entrepreneurs, the people that don't have big ideas, they don't have access to venture capital, they don't have Stanford degrees, they're just ordinary people, and they're being innovative and entrepreneurial in their life. They don't all own their own business. They work in schools, they work in organizations, they work in nonprofit and government. We just really wanted to understand their mindset and their methods, and how the two things primarily we wanted to understand, how do they recognize opportunities that others overlook? And then how do they bring an idea to life, right? How do they see something that others don't see, and how do they bring that into the world as an idea that's useful? So that's what I've been studying for a long time. I was interviewing entrepreneurs around the United States with a film crew as this research project for Cisco. And I came across an entrepreneur in Tulsa, Oklahoma named Clifton Talbert. Now, Mr. Talbert is a Pulitzer nominee. He's one of the founders of the Stairmaster Exercise Company. He's owned banks. He's lectured the Supreme Court. He's written 12 books. He's made major motion pictures. Very entrepreneurial life. Dedicated himself to helping others. Very prolific entrepreneur. And when I asked him how he learned how to think like an entrepreneur, he explained to me that he was born in the Mississippi Delta in 1945, and he was born to a teenage mother, didn't know a father. He was born in this very poor cotton community at the height of the Jim Crow South, and there wasn't much opportunity, right? He's basically he's living with relatives, and he said, when I wasn't in school, I was in the cotton fields. This was the expected way of life. And he pulled out this picture that you're looking at here, and he showed this to me. And he said, this is the man that taught me how to think like an entrepreneur. He said, this is my Uncle Cleve. And Uncle Cleve owned the local ice house. He had a 4th or 5th grade education, a very rudimentary education, but he was always learning, right? And he was always curious, and he was a quiet guy. He wasn't allowed in the bank, but every 2 weeks they went to the bank. They had to go in the back door. They weren't welcome in the bank. And Clifton said to me, this was a time and a place where African Americans weren't even welcome. And the idea of banking was just something that wasn't on people's radars. But Uncle Cleve was the guy that took money to the bank, as Clifton said. And as he began to explain to me sort of the underlying mindset and the methods, that these things that his uncle was teaching him as a young boy, as 13 years old, 1958, there were these universal concepts that I kept hearing over and over and over in entrepreneurial stories, these core concepts. And so about a year later, I convinced Clifton that we were going to co-author a book, which we did. It's called Who Owns the Ice House? The subtitle is 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur. And it's really, those 8 life lessons, which are the core of our curriculum, were sort of 8 core concepts that we distilled from hundreds of interviews with entrepreneurs across the United States. We just told them through this single story. And I'm gonna, if you're interested in the book, you can find it on Amazon. You can find it in bookstores. You can buy it on our website if you're interested. But we got some initial funding from the Kauffman Foundation, and we translated this book into a curriculum called the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. And that's really what I want to kind of tell you a little bit about how this is structured, and kind of how this program works, and why. What I really want to get into here is explain, like, one of the things I wanted to know is, like, why are entrepreneurs so engaged? Why are they so curious? Why are they self-directed learners? Why are they so resilient? Like, why do they behave that way, right? And what can we learn from them that we can all apply to our lives, regardless of what we're doing, regardless if we're a teacher or we work in a government organization, a nonprofit, a for-profit, or start a business, have a side hustle, whatever, right? So that's what the Ice House program is really all about. And I want to just kind of spell it out how we framed it. It's based on experiential learning. It's based on project-based learning, peer-to-peer learning, and self-directed learning. So when we observed what entrepreneurs were actually doing, as if, you went out on a safari with night vision goggles, when you observe what they do, this is what they do. I just translated their behavior into, terms that educators understand. It's experiential project-based learning. They're teaching each other, and it's self-directed learning. So what we wanted to do is expose the students to these 8 core concepts. And, well, let me back up. So expose them to the 8 core concepts, immerse them in real-world experiences, and reinforce the concepts with relatable social models. And I'm going to go through all 3 of those things very briefly here, but starting with these 8 core concepts that we observed with the entrepreneurs. So the first and foremost thing that I want to talk about is what we hear in the stories of the entrepreneur is that they are always articulating some sort of a vision. There's something they're trying to accomplish, right? Something that has meaning to them, some sort of a compelling goal. And we sort of labeled this the power to choose, because we stepped back and we said, you know what? They're not allowing the circumstances to dictate their life course. They're choosing their life course regardless of the circumstances. And that's a powerful, powerful concept. And, what I've actually done is, having interviewed now 400 or 500 entrepreneurs around the world, as I began to recognize the patterns, like, so sort of the common aspects in their language and their logic and their beliefs and their behavior and their circumstances, and then, I began to turn to the psychological, behavioral literature to sort of understand what I was seeing here. And so I'm going to explain this sort of from both of these perspectives. When you observe entrepreneurs, they'll articulate some sort of a compelling vision, a compelling goal, right? They're choosing the future rather than just accepting things as they are, right? Now, what we've learned from the psychological research is that what happens to a person when we have a compelling goal, it orients us towards the future in a positive way. This is what the psychologist Philip Zimbardo refers to as like a time orientation, right? Some of us have a past regret orientation. Some of us might have a past nostalgic orientation. Some of us might have a present hedonistic, or just stay in the moment. Some of us might have a future anxiety orientation, like I'm anxious about the future, I'm uncertain about the future. And some might have a positive future orientation. And what we're starting to see from a number of studies is that, so for example, one study showed that of hundreds of people that have gotten themselves out of poverty in a single generation, the single common denominator was the fact that they had a future positive orientation. So that's one of the most profound and common sort of the bedrock of these concepts. Is like you're choosing the future. You're not just living in the world as it is. You're choosing to like influence the world around you and choose your future. The second thing we observed in the entrepreneurs is they tend to look at problems as opportunities. And this is really also sort of a hidden gem, if you will. And what we notice is that they tend to look at problems as potential opportunities. So most of us try to avoid problems, or we want to complain about problems. But the entrepreneurs thinks, you know what? If I can find a problem and I can solve a problem that can be beneficial to others, it's going to help me. So this is really here again, a fundamental shift occurs here, right? And what we saw in entrepreneurs when they talked about their failures, they talked about, I just wanted to make money and that's why I failed, right? So they you heard the story. Okay, I want to open a coffee shop because I don't like my job. I don't want to learn too much. I want to drive too far or work too hard. So I'm going to open a coffee shop down the street from my house, and that I can have an easy life. Well, when you analyze that, that's all about the individual, and that's kind of a recipe for failure. The entrepreneurials that were successful are the ones that found a problem and they validated that lots of people have the problem, and then they went about solving the problem. So it's sort of this, it's an empathic worldview. It causes the individual to shift away from just doing, just satisfying your own needs or enriching yourself or thinking about getting your own needs met, to a broader awareness of what's going on around us, what's missing, what can be improved. Every frustration, every unmet need I encounter, I'm looking at it as a possible opportunity. How can I fix this? How can I make it better? Why are we doing it this way? It's a very important concept that really helps us understand how they see opportunities the rest of us overlook. It's really deceptively simple. They see problems as opportunities. The next thing I want to bring up that we've observed in entrepreneurs is that they're action-oriented. And here again, there's a lot to unpack here. What we see in the entrepreneurs is this sort of bias towards action. They come up with an idea and they almost immediately start testing the idea. And to the uninitiated, this... Did you get the airline tickets? Someone needs, there we go. Okay, so this action orientation appears to be recklessness. But when you look beneath the surface, what they're really doing is they're micro experimenting, right? They're not, a lot of people think being entrepreneurial means I've got to mortgage my house, drop out of school, quit my job, put everything on the line and hope it works. And they think of it as this enormous risk-taking, adventure. And it's not really that. It's The successful entrepreneurials, they're micro experimenters. They're always looking for problems and trying to solve problems from in lots of little ways, right? They just sort of have a problem solving orientation that involves these experiments. Now, what's key to understanding here is that the micro experimentation enables them to tease out opportunities that are latent, but they're present but not visible, right? And that's where, so if you think of the entrepreneur as a detective or a scientist, they're trying to solve a mystery. They're not writing business plans. They're trying to solve mysteries, and they're always looking for a problem to solve and then testing the idea to see if it would work. But they're testing it in little ways that don't cost a lot of money, don't take a lot of time, and they learn from their experiments. They become students of human behavior. They become very creative at designing and conducting experiments. And you know what I say to teachers in the teacher training that we do is, you know, don't tell your students, but entrepreneurship is really the scientific method. They have a hypothesis. They learn how to design and conduct experiments. They learn from the feedback, and they keep adapting. I mean, that's essentially what they're doing. They're behaving like a detective or a scientist, not like a gambler or a fortune teller. The third thing, or the fourth thing I wanted to mention that we've observed in the entrepreneurs is that they are voracious, self-directed learners. And you know, they're curious. They're much more curious. They're much more self-directed in their learning than non-entrepreneurs. And you know, so why is this? Well, what we see is that the entrepreneurial, from their experience, they tend to understand that the knowledge and effort equals outcome. And so once you understand that solving problems for other people empowers you, that tends to make you more curious. You start looking around. You want to understand how things work. Why are people doing it this way? Why does it work that way? What's going on here? So there's this constant learning process, and the learning, you know, they tend to learn in a multitude of ways. They learn from each other. They learn from audiobooks or just from reading or from seminars or from classes or from YouTube or whatever. But that's a pattern that we see, is that they're always learning. It's almost always in a state of learning. And so we see these second, third, and fourth concepts as sort of the engine of entrepreneurial activity, right? They're looking for problems to solve, they're testing ideas, and they're learning. And this is sort of a loop that's almost constantly happening. And, you know, it's not obvious. It's not obvious to the casual observer, but this is kind of the engine of the entrepreneurial-minded person, looking for problems to solve, micro-experimenting, and learning. As a result of this behavior, they tend to become very resourceful. And, you know, they learn how, they understand the difference between spending and investing, right? They're much more likely, they learn how to make things work with what they have, as opposed to what we see in the media all the time, that, oh, they, you know, get millions of dollars in venture capital. You know, what the data show are that entrepreneurs, even very successful entrepreneurs, most often start with a very, very small amount of money. I've seen research that shows that a fraction of a single percent of all businesses started in the United States are created with venture capital. It's a tiny, tiny fraction. And in fact, what we've found is that the resource constraints are actually instrumental in helping develop the entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills, right? They don't allow the resource constraints to stop them. They become resourceful. They learn how to make the most of their time, of their money, of their mental capacity, of their social networks. They learn to leverage what they have. They also learn to become reliable, right? And I don't think of this so much in terms of character building. I think of it in terms of context. So when we operate in a system where we're constantly being told what to do, when we're functioning in rule-bound systems, where the rules are designed by others, we're more likely to come up with excuses. The dog ate my homework. I can't make it in today because I have a runny nose. You know, so that's more of a natural outcome of an externally controlled environment. Whereas in an entrepreneurial situation, as a problem solver, you realize like you need to be reliable. And it's not saying that you're reliable, but that by being consistently reliable, you start to generate opportunities. The more reliable that you are, the more opportunities tend to come to you. You kind of create your own luck. The other thing we have observed is that the entrepreneurs tend to create this intentional support networks, right? Most of us just kind of hang around people that think and act just like we do. We kind of, self-select into to peer groups of people that, think and act like we do. But what we see in the entrepreneurials is because they have a compelling goal, the first lesson, the power to choose, they tend to seek out mentors or people that are a little more successful than them, a little further down the road, people that will help them. So they create this learning community, a support community. They are also, when they become successful, are much more engaged and involved in the community. They're much more likely to give back to the community. And one of the things we've instilled in the Ice House program is encouraging the students to identify and interact with local entrepreneurials and invite them into the learning experience, and so they can engage with the entrepreneurs in their community. The eighth of the 8 life lessons that we've observed from our research is that entrepreneurs tend to be highly resilient, right? They just don't give up as easily as, say, a non-entrepreneur. And, we know from the research that resilience comes from an optimistic explanatory style, right? And it sort of goes to the mindset, like you didn't really know you had an explanatory style, did you? Well, some of us have an optimistic explanatory style, and some of us have a pessimistic explanatory style. So essentially what means is, what's the story that we tell ourselves when we're in some kind of an adverse situation? Do we tell ourselves this is temporary, this is local, this is fixable? Or do we tell ourselves, this always happens to me, this is permanent, this always works out this way, it's always, That's sort of a pessimistic explanatory style. And we so often explain adversity to ourselves. It's so deeply embedded in our psyche that feedback loop is so deeply embedded that we don't even realize we're doing it. When we look at the research in positive psychology, what we see is that resilience can be developed through a deliberate practice of an optimistic explanatory style. And we've embedded tools in the program to teach ourselves about learned optimism. And Dr. Martin Seligman at Penn has kind of pioneered the positive psychology and the power of of an optimistic outlook and how to develop that in yourself and your students. And there's an audio book. It's called Optimism, written by Martin Seligman. It's probably the best $7 I've ever spent in my life. It's about 2 hours long. I've listened to it 2 or 3 times. It's one of those audio books that I'll just pull back up every 6 months and listen to it again. It really teaches us how to develop the resilience through an optimistic perspective. So those are the 8 core concepts that students are immersed in the Ice House program. Then what we ask the students to do is to organize in small groups of 3 or 4 students and begin to identify problems in their world that they want to solve. And this is where we get into the experiential part of the program. So we start asking the students, what problems do you want to solve? What problems do you see in your community, experience in your day-to-day lives that you want to solve? And so this is where we get into the entrepreneurial learning again. And I sorry for the redundancy in the slide here. This is the experiential, project-based, peer-to-peer, and self-directed learning component. The point here that I want to make is that we're asking students to solve ill-structured problems, and that's the key to developing these entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills, is that these are not problems. This is not like, you as the teacher know the outcome. These are complex problems. There's no one right answer. They're real-world problems. They require collaboration. They evolve with new information. They spark controversy, and they engage questions. So that's the real key here is teaching the students to identify and solve problems amidst the ambiguity and the resource constraint. That's really the key. So we developed this tool called the Ice House Opportunity Discovery Canvas to help them do that. And it sort of breaks opportunity discovery down into 3 categories. It starts with finding the problem. Like, what's the problem you want to solve, right? And understanding that problem, diagnosing the problem before you prescribe. So in the first 3 boxes, it's describe the problem you want to solve, who has the problem, and how are they currently solving it. So broadly speaking, this requires observation and inquiry. It starts with empathy. It starts with observing and understanding the problem, right? I'm fond of saying when a doctor prescribes before they diagnose, they get sued for malpractice, right? When an entrepreneur prescribes before they diagnose, they go bankrupt. So this is really about understanding the problem from the perspective of the person who has the problem. And so we generate some questions to get the students thinking about the problem and talking to people who have the problem to better understand it. The second phase is about experimentation. Once you understand the problem, then and only then are you prepared to start designing experiments, coming up with ideas. Describe your proposed solution. How will it be different? How will you know this people will buy into your solution? Like, where's the evidence that it's useful? And evidence can come in many forms. People just using your idea, people buying it, people talking about it, people getting excited about it. You need to see evidence of usefulness. And I don't really care what the evidence is. The point is this is an evidence-based process. It's not gambling. It's not fortune telling. It's detective work. It's the scientific method. Once we feel like we've got a connection, as problem solution fit, we've got evidence of usefulness, then we begin to advocate for the idea and start to implement it, right? But we don't do that until we have evidence. We don't try to recruit people. We don't try to convince people, all right, we got the greatest idea in the world, until we have evidence that it actually works. So those are the 3 phases. This is an opportunity discovery canvas. It's drawing from the best practices in design thinking. They're just made very simple. So lastly, the other important ingredient in the Ice House program is it's sort of the concepts are reinforced with relatable social models. So we've inserted, there's video segments from some of the interviews we've done with entrepreneurial people, and they're learning from people who have done what, they get to hear little short video clips that help reinforce the core concepts. The top left is Dawn Haffaker. She was a severely disabled Iraq veteran, lost her right arm in the Iraq war. Jason Campbell, the second guy there, is a foster kid that sort of changed the trajectory of his life by learning how to think like an entrepreneur. Ryan Blair, the third guy, was a juvenile delinquent, got in a lot of trouble as a kid. His mom started dating an entrepreneur who taught him how to think this way, and it changed the trajectory of his life. The top right is Brian Scudamore, the founder of 1-800-GOT-JUNK. It's a company he started as a as an 18-year-old just after graduating from high school. He started it with $1,000 as a way to pay for college. Of course, it's gone all over the world. You've all heard of 1-800-GOT-JUNK. Bottom left is Rodney Walker. This is an extraordinary kid. He was in 12 different foster homes. Both his parents were incarcerated. He was living on his own for a while at 16 years old. And he took an entrepreneurship course in ninth grade. He was held back 2 years in school. He wasn't a great student. Took an entrepreneur course and talked about, I realized I could apply this entrepreneurial thinking to my school, to learning. And that transformation, Rodney went from like a 1.2 GPA in ninth grade. He graduated from high school with a 4.0. He went to Morehouse College on a provisional scholarship, graduated from Morehouse, went on to Yale to do a master's degree. And last summer, he graduated from Harvard with a PhD. And Rodney's an incredibly humble young man that can very clearly articulate how he overcame some of the challenges and applied entrepreneurial thinking to learning and how that changed his life. The two women at the bottom are students of the Ice House program that will talk about how that it changed their understanding of learning and the importance of learning and how it changed their view of learning. Bottom right is the father and daughter, Ted and Serena Moore, in Philadelphia. They started a construction site cleaning business with $200 that they took to more than $1 million in revenue. So, you know, these aren't the big name Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. I mean, Brian Scudamore is kind of a big name guy, but these are just ordinary people that have transformed their lives by being entrepreneurial. So the point I really want to make there, I'm going to go back if this will let me. The point about the case studies that I wanted to make is that without the relatable social models, it's unlikely that we'll adopt the new behavior. And that's really part of the magic of the Ice House program, is the students get to see these examples, which is really where the inspiration, the motivation comes from. So we launched the Ice House program with initial funding from the Kauffman Foundation in 2011. Since that time, the program has been used in ways that we could never have anticipated. It's gone all over the world. It's being used in high schools, community colleges, 4 years, economic development initiatives, veteran initiatives, small business development, libraries are starting to take this on. It's crazy. Being used very effectively for reentry program for returning citizens. Even city governments are using the Ice House program to teach the city government workers how to think like entrepreneurs. There's this phenomenon going on in Albuquerque. If you Google search mindset memo, they made a video about the ways this has transformed their city government. We're also seeing this used in nonprofits. But so there's just recently, about 2 years ago, some folks came to us from the Erie Public School District, and I'll talk about that in a second. So I got ahead of myself. Since we launched the program, it's been featured on NPR, on CNN, USA Today, Huffington Post. The Ice House program has been presented to the United Nations General Assembly in New York. The vice president of the Kauffman Foundation was invited to a papal council at the Vatican to present it to a council on peace and justice. I presented the Ice House program to the European Commission, a panel of the European Commission in Brussels. So, you know, this has been recognized, you know, both across the United States and internationally. The thing I want to bring to your attention is a couple of years ago, we were approached by the Erie Public School District, and they said, we want to use this in our middle schools. And at first, my reaction was, wait a minute, what? This is not really made for a middle school. They trained 30 teachers, went through the Ice House training program. They rolled up their sleeves. They modified the course content. They did an initial pilot with 850 students in the middle schools in Erie Public Schools. What came of that pilot was nothing short of astonishing. I have a few outcomes. They made a video about it. You can see, if you Google search Ice House Erie, you can watch the video. But I got a couple of screen captures here on some of the comments from the students, right? This kid, Brandon, is saying, allowed me to see things differently, to see more solutions to one problem, right? Simon is saying, I'm having an entrepreneurial mindset, changed how I see the world. now I know I can change things. What this girl was saying, Shauna, was just incredible. She said, I realize I'm not the government, but I can make changes in the world around me. Amanda, this kid's incredible. She said, I know what I can do as a person to really build a future for myself. This last one, that Madison Porter, just about
Gary, are you there?
I think we may have lost him. In the meantime, hopefully he'll get reconnected. If you want to start to put questions in the chat box, we'll get ready to ask him when he can reconnect.
get my slides back up here. All right. So what I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted by this Wi-Fi failure, is that we need to recognize that the entrepreneurial spirit is the human spirit, and it's not just in some kids, it's in all kids. We all have a desire. We don't all have a desire to own a business per se, but we all have a desire to be engaged in work that matters, to be solving problems that we benefit other people, and we have a need to see our work lead towards a more meaningful and prosperous life. That's sort of the trifecta of engagement, of human engagement. And that's why entrepreneurial activity engages the student in their learning. So at the end of the day, what we recognize is that entrepreneurship is simply an opportunity discovery process. That's all it is. If you just think of it that way, we've now defined it in a way that we can invite everyone in. Not everyone wants to start a business, but we all want to discover opportunities. Opportunity discovery requires opportunity discovery skills, right? It starts with empathy, observation and inquiry, experimentation and adaptation, creativity and critical thinking, effective communication, teamwork, collaboration, effective problem solving, resourcefulness and agility, self-directed learning, and self-regulation, right? And those are the reason I'm putting this up there, because I want to demonstrate, like, these are entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. These are attitudes, behaviors, and skills that anyone can learn to develop. They're attitudes, behaviors, and skills that have historically been overlooked, undervalued, or ignored in our systems of education. Right? Henry Ford was not looking for creative, critical thinkers. So what I also want to demonstrate is the overlap between the 21st century skills, right? Entrepreneurial skills are perfectly aligned with 21st century skills. These are the skills that educators around the world have identified as the skills every student will need to adapt and thrive in the 21st century. Not only will these skills enable students to adapt and thrive, it'll also empower them to make a greater contribution to the world, to their communities, to the organizations they work in, to the broader world around them. I mean, that's really the power of entrepreneurship. It's kind of like there's a double whammy there. It not only creates this higher level of engagement, helps the student become future-proof, but also empowers them to make a greater contribution to the world. So just to sort of end this, what I want to say is I think what we need to think about to bring entrepreneurship from the perimeter to the core, we need to stop asking students what they want to be when they grow up. We need to start asking them what problems they want to solve and what they need to learn in order to solve those problems. I mean, I think that's the key. It's a simple, subtle shift away from the assumption that you're going to work in an established organization where someone else is going to tell you what's useful, and shift the responsibility to the individual to figure out how to use your talent, your skills, your knowledge to make yourself useful to others. So if you want to learn more about the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program, if you want to become an authorized Ice House facilitator to bring this to your classroom or your school, we have 3 public facilitator trainings around the U.S. each year. The next one is in Lindenwood University in St. Louis, June 10th through 12th. We also do, a dozen or 15 private trainings, like schools bring us in to train 20 or 30 faculty, or, we have school districts work together to bring us in. We have a 15-person minimum. School districts will cobble together 15 people, and we'll come and do an on-site training for a school district. The next public training is in June at Lindenwood University. You can learn a lot more about the Ice House program and the work that we are doing at EliMindset.com. So I'll stop talking now, and I'll open this up to any questions or comments that you guys might have. And again, thank you for attending.
I'll start us off with a question. You mentioned a book called Optimism. What was the author on that?
It was Martin Seligman. I mean, he's a lead author. I think it's a secondary author, but it's Martin Seligman, Optimism. It was an audio book. I bought it, but it's just super good. Everything Martin Seligman writes is really good. There's another book he wrote called Flourishing. It's just amazing. I'm probably responsible for selling 1,000 copies of that book.
Wonderful. Thank you. Other questions?
Gary, I had a question. So with these schools, I know Erie's doing it, like you said. When do they embed it with all of their content in the classrooms, or do they have like a period where it's like entrepreneurial class?
Well, it was embedded in social studies.
Okay.
It was a 9-week course in the social studies.
Okay, and how do they tackle the 8 mindsets about the goal setting, the visions? What do you recommend in the classroom? Like, we sit with students that some of them are motivated for much. What do you guys recommend? How do you build that mindset?
Yeah, so we start the first thing in the course is asking students about what kind of life they want for themselves. Start writing about sort of self-authoring about a positive future. What's the future you want for yourself? If you could create whatever future you want, what does that look like, right? And asking the students, do you want to pursue an opportunity? What does that look like for you?
Mm-hmm.
Right, so that self-authoring is trying to orient towards a future positive orientation. And then using the case studies, using the story of Uncle Cleve to sort of, start using storytelling to sort of engage the students in the concept. Now, there's a guy named Dave Cross there who's sort of the lead teacher, and I'd be happy to connect you guys with him. He can provide a lot more in-depth, exactly what what he was doing on a day-to-day basis. His name is Dave Cross, and I'm going to just type his name in the chat there.
Okay.
And if you send me an email, I will connect you with him. He was sort of the lead teacher that really rolled up his sleeves and modified the curriculum for middle school students. Now, the response was so positive that they're just sort of doubling the efforts in Erie. We've also, we're engaged with Dave now to help us develop specifically a middle school version of the Ice House program that we expect to have available in August of 2019.
Nice, thank you.
So Melinda's asking, do we have any connections that have focus on elementary students? I don't, Melinda. That's a good question. And what we have on the website is a book discussion guide. So if you go to the website and download discussion guide, there's a comprehensive, you can buy a copy of the book, use the discussion guide, and in the discussion guide, we put little videos from Clifton Talbert, sort of talking about the lessons from his Uncle Cleve. So you can, play this little 2-minute video and then engage students in a dialogue around the book concepts. I've heard from many parents that have done things with 10 and 12-year-olds, and incredible things. I talked to one guy who said his 12-year-old kid was obsessed with video games, and he wanted $400 to buy another video game, and his dad said, like, no way, if you want $400, you got to earn it yourself. The kid said, well, Dad, how am I going to earn $400? And well, let's think about that. And they came up with a plan to build and sell birdhouses. The kid liked to work with tools, so he started building birdhouses, and he started selling birdhouses at first friends and family, then neighbors and whatever. And his dad said, my son forgot all about the Sony, the video games. He's now online researching bird species and habitat and trying to figure out, different kinds of birdhouses. I mean, I've heard story after story of that from, 8, 10, 12-year-old kids doing incredible things. It's really about engaging them and solving problems they care about. So thank you for that question, Melinda.
Other questions?
If you want to learn more about the Erie thing, as I said, Google search Ice House Erie, and I'll just put that in here. They made a video about it. Also, look at this Mindset Memo. In Albuquerque, they did a pilot in the school system as well, and they made a video about that. And so you can watch that if you go to see mindsetmemo.com. Interestingly enough, there's a poet laureate that lives in Albuquerque who wrote a poem about the ice house, which is kind of cool. I think, what I wanted to end with is to really say, it's like if you want to understand, I mean, the key to this whole thing is engaging students in solving problems that they care about. I spoke at the SAS conference, I don't know when that was, a few months ago in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And a teacher tweeted at me that, maybe instead of instilling entrepreneurship in the curriculum, we need to put the curriculum into entrepreneurship. And it took me a minute to wrap my head around what she was saying. But the idea is that if we allow students to solve problems they care about, they'll develop the attitudes, behaviors, and skills that we want them to develop. If we just try to get them to develop the attitudes, behaviors, and skills, it's pushing a big boulder up a big hill. It just sort of flips the script. It's like Viktor Frankl said, like, you can't pursue happiness. The happiness ensues from the work you're doing, right? And I think it's the same way. It's if you want students to become creative, critical thinkers and self-directed learners and so forth, allow them to solve problems they care about.
Excellent. Well, we want to thank you for your time tonight, Gary, and for being here for PACT's webinar and sharing with our members the importance of this mindset. I want to remind all of you as members that we have upcoming webinars and other events that are coming, and please be on the lookout for a survey from us about the kinds of learning that you want to do next year. We're in the middle of some strategic planning, so please be on the lookout for that. And as always, if you have any questions, you can reach us through the website. Thank you, Gary, for sharing your website, your email address as well. We appreciate your time tonight, and thank you for being here.
Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.